Have you ever wondered how a single act of kindness could spiral into unimaginable chaos? Tonight, we begin the story of Joseph Hartman, a man who thought he was doing good but opened a door to tragedy. As the rain poured down and the winds howled, his life changed forever, leaving heartbreak and betrayal in its wake. Don't miss a moment of this emotional journey. If you're as intrigued as we are, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow along. The rain battered the streets of Houston relentlessly, each drop echoing like the ticking of an unseen clock. Joseph Hartman sat behind the wheel of his luxury car, staring at the empty road ahead. The storm had turned the city into a ghost town, with flickering streetlights casting eerie shadows on the deserted sidewalks. As Joseph neared the industrial district where his factory stood, he noticed a figure slumped against the factory gates. His headlights illuminated a man drenched to the bone, clutching a thin blanket around his shoulders. Joseph slowed the car, his chest tightening with an unbidden memory of his own difficult childhood. "Hey!" Joseph called out, stepping into the rain. "Are you okay?" The man looked up, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. I needed to get out of the rain," he murmured, shivering violently. Joseph hesitated, his business instincts screaming at him to keep walking. But the man's trembling hands reminded him of the nights he and his younger brother, Daniel, huddled together in a tiny apartment, wondering where their next meal would come from. Joseph's success had buried those memories deep, but tonight they surfaced with haunting clarity. "You can stay in the factory for the night," Joseph said finally, unlocking the side door. "But just for tonight." The man nodded, his gratitude evident despite his silence. He introduced himself as Hank, a drifter with no home and no family, before disappearing into the warmth of the factory. The next morning, the city awoke to horror. Smoke billowed into the gray sky as fire trucks surrounded the remains of Hartman Craft Distillery. Flames had consumed the factory overnight, leaving little more than charred beams and twisted machinery. Joseph arrived at the scene, his heart pounding in disbelief. No, he muttered, running toward the smoldering ruins. A firefighter stopped him. "Sir, it's not safe." "My factory!" Joseph shouted. "What happened?" "Arson, maybe," the firefighter said grimly. "We won't know until the investigation's complete." Joseph's head spun as his phone buzzed incessantly. The factory was insured, but it was more than just a building, it was his life's work. It was also where he had last seen Hank. At home, his 12-year-old daughter, Lily, waited by the window, watching the rain taper off. She had heard the news and felt the weight of the tragedy in the air. When Joseph finally returned, soaked and exhausted, Lily ran to him. "Dad, is it true?" "The factory, it's gone?" Joseph nodded, collapsing onto the couch. "It's gone, Lily. All of it." Lily hesitated, her small hand clutching a locket around her neck, a gift from her father when he first opened the distillery. It was the only thing she had that truly connected them. Her father's work had always come first, leaving her to compete with a factory for his attention. "Why did this happen?" she asked softly. Joseph looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have." He trailed off, the image of Hank flashing in his mind. Had he made a mistake in trusting the man? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his brother Daniel's voice over the phone. "You need to get your story straight," Daniel said brusquely. "The media's already sniffing around. Don't mention anything about that guy you let in." "What are you saying?" Joseph asked, his voice rising. "Are you accusing him?" "I'm saying it doesn't look good, Joe," Daniel replied. "A stranger in your factory, and now it's ashes? Think about it." Hank was nowhere to be found, and the suspicion gnawed at Joseph. Could the man he tried to help have betrayed him so callously? Lily sat quietly in her room that night, staring at the locket. She overheard her father on the phone, his voice trembling with frustration. She wanted to comfort him, but she didn't know how. Instead, she opened her sketchbook, drawing the factory as she remembered it, alive, bustling, and warm. 2 days later, the investigation revealed muddy footprints leading to a broken window in the factory. Joseph stared at the evidence, his mind spinning. Was it Hank? Or was there something, or someone else at play? Lily found him pacing in the living room, clutching a glass of whiskey. "Dad," she began cautiously, "what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Joseph admitted, his voice breaking. "But I'll find out who's responsible. I promise." The weight of that promise hung heavy in the air. As Joseph stared into the bottom of his glass, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fire was only the beginning. The Hartman household was eerily quiet. The smell of ash from the destroyed factory seemed to linger in the air, even miles away. Lily sat on the edge of her bed, watching the rain trickle down her window. Joseph had been locked in his study for hours, refusing to speak to anyone. She had never seen her father so distraught, and it frightened her. Downstairs, the television hummed with breaking news. The destruction of Hartman Craft Distillery had captured the city's attention. Reporters speculated about the cause, with phrases like suspicious circumstances and insurance fraud whispered among the anchors. Lily's stomach churned as she heard her father's name mentioned. She tiptoed into the living room, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized couch. Her mother, Emma, sat with a glass of wine, her eyes glued to the screen. "Mom," Lily said hesitantly, "why are they saying those things about Dad?" Emma didn't respond immediately. She sighed heavily, turning off the television. "They're just trying to make a story out of nothing, sweetheart." "But what if they're right?" Lily whispered. "What if Dad—" "Enough!" Emma snapped, her voice sharp. "Don't talk about your father like that." Lily recoiled, her cheeks flushing with shame. She retreated to her room, the locket around her neck feeling heavier than ever. She missed the days when her father was her hero, untouchable and strong. Now, he seemed like a stranger, one she didn't know how to reach. In his study, Joseph sat amidst a sea of paperwork, staring blankly at a report from the fire department. The muddy footprints leading to the broken window gnawed at him. He had trusted Hank, but now he couldn't shake the suspicion that he'd been played. His phone buzzed, and he saw Daniel's name flashing on the screen. "Joe," Daniel began without preamble, "you need to get ahead of this. The media's already painting you as the villain." "I didn't do anything wrong," Joseph snapped, his voice hoarse. "You know that." "Do I?" Daniel retorted, his tone icy. "You brought a stranger into your factory the night it burned to the ground. That doesn't exactly scream innocent." Joseph's grip on the phone tightened. "You think I wanted this? I was trying to help someone. And now your entire business is gone," Daniel said coldly. "You've got to be smarter, Joe. The insurance claims your only shot at saving what's left. Don't screw it up." Joseph hung up without replying, his brother's words echoing in his ears. He poured himself another drink, his mind clouded with doubt and guilt. Had he been foolish to trust Hank? Or was there something more sinister at play? The following morning, Lily ventured into the kitchen, hoping to catch her father before he disappeared again. She found him staring out the window, his face lined with exhaustion. "Dad," she said softly. Joseph turned, his expression softening at the sight of her. "Good morning, sweetheart." "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Joseph knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "I'm trying to be," he admitted. "I know this has been hard on you, Lily. I promise I'm going to fix it." Lily nodded, but she couldn't hide the doubt in her eyes. "Do you think it was Hank?" Joseph hesitated, the question cutting through him like a knife. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'll find out." Later that day, Lily accompanied her mother to the grocery store. The aisles were crowded with people murmuring about the fire, their whispers sharp and biting. "Did you hear? They think it was arson," a woman said to her friend, glancing over her shoulder as Emma passed. "Wouldn't be surprised," the other replied. "That family always did seem too perfect." Emma's jaw tightened, and she steered Lily away from the gossiping women. But the words clung to Lily like a shadow. She didn't understand why people were so quick to judge her father. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a bad person. Was he? As they returned to the car, Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "Stay here," she told Lily, stepping a few feet away to answer the call. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but Lily could still hear the tension in her tone. "I told you not to call me," Emma hissed. "Do you want him to find out?" Lily's heart sank. Who was her mother talking to? And what didn't she want her father to know? That evening, as the rain started again, Lily sat at the dinner table with her parents. The meal was quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional clink of silverware. Joseph looked as though he hadn't slept in days, while Emma stared blankly at her plate. "Did you find out anything about the fire?" Lily asked, breaking the silence. Joseph exchanged a glance with Emma before answering. "Not yet," he said carefully. "But the investigators are working on it." "Do they think it was Hank?" Lily pressed. "Lily, enough," Emma interjected sharply. "Let your father handle it." Lily shrank back, her appetite vanishing. She didn't understand why her mother was so defensive, and the tension between her parents was growing more palpable by the day. After dinner, Lily crept into her father's study. She had seen him leave a stack of papers on his desk, and her curiosity got the better of her. As she rifled through the documents, her eyes landed on a photograph, a grainy image of a figure near the factory the night of the fire. The face was indistinct, but the posture was unmistakable. It wasn't Hank. Her heart pounded as she stuffed the photo into her pocket. She had to tell her father, but as she turned to leave, she heard voices outside the study. She pressed herself against the wall, listening intently. "We need to stay united," Emma was saying. "The last thing we need is Lily getting dragged into this." Joseph sighed. "I know. But I can't ignore the possibility that someone close to us was involved." "Don't," Emma warned. "You don't know what you're talking about." Lily's breath hitched. What were her parents hiding? And why did her mother seem so desperate to protect someone? She slipped out of the study, her mind racing. The photograph in her pocket felt like a ticking time bomb. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but one thing was clear: the answers she sought would not come easily. The rain had eased into a gentle drizzle, but the tension inside the Hartman house was as thick as ever. Lily lay awake in her bed, clutching the grainy photograph she had found in her father's study. The shadowy figure near the factory haunted her thoughts. She had to show it to her father, but a nagging feeling told her it might only make things worse. Downstairs, Joseph pored over the fire investigation reports. His fingers traced the footprints in the photograph attached to the report. The window had been shattered from the outside, and the muddy tracks suggested someone had fled into the night. The insurance investigators had started poking around, and the local news stations were painting Joseph as a desperate businessman willing to burn down his empire for a payout. A knock at the front door startled him. He set the papers aside and opened the door to find a police officer standing in the rain. "Mr. Hartman," the officer began, his voice neutral, "we've located Hank." Joseph's heart skipped. "Where?" "Near the train yard. He was trying to hop a freight car. We brought him in for questioning, but he's not talking much." "Thought you'd like to know." Joseph nodded, a mix of relief and trepidation flooding his chest. "Did he say anything about the fire?" "Just denies it," the officer replied. "But given the circumstances, well, you understand why he's our primary suspect." Joseph thanked the officer and closed the door. For a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of guilt. Hank had seemed so grateful that night. Could he really have betrayed him? The next morning, Lily sat at the breakfast table, her gaze flitting between her parents. The photograph burned in her pocket, but she wasn't sure how to bring it up. Emma sipped her coffee, her eyes distant, while Joseph barely touched his food. "Dad," Lily ventured, her voice tentative, "what are you going to do about Hank?" Joseph sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Lily. The police think he did it. Do you think he did? She pressed, her small fingers tightening around her locket. Joseph hesitated, the weight of his uncertainty evident. I want to believe he didn't. But I can't ignore the evidence. Lily bit her lip. What if it wasn't him? Lily, Emma cut in sharply, this isn't your concern. Let your father handle it. But... enough. Emma's voice was firm, and Lily fell silent, her cheeks burning with frustration. She pushed her plate away and stormed up to her room, the photograph still tucked safely in her pocket. Later that day, Lily decided to take matters into her own hands. She stuffed the photograph into her backpack and slipped out of the house while her parents were preoccupied. The library downtown was a quiet, imposing building that always felt safe to her. She found a corner table and spread out the photograph, staring at it intently. She didn't know who the figure was, but something about the posture seemed familiar. The way they leaned slightly to one side, the awkward bend in their arm, it tugged at a memory she couldn't quite place. She flipped through an old yearbook she had borrowed from the library's archives, scanning the pages for anything that might jog her memory. A librarian approached, her soft footsteps startling Lily. Looking for something, dear? Lily quickly closed the book, covering the photograph with her hand. Just doing some research. The librarian smiled kindly. If you need help, let me know. Lily nodded, her heart racing as the librarian walked away. She didn't want anyone else involved, not yet. She folded the photograph and slipped it back into her backpack, determined to figure it out on her own. When she returned home, Joseph was pacing in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her. Lily, where have you been? He demanded, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard. I went to the library, she said defensively. It's not like I ran away. You should have told me, he said, his voice softening but still laced with worry. It's not safe to wander off right now. Why? Because of the fire, she challenged, crossing her arms. Joseph sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because things are complicated right now. I just want to keep you safe. Lily hesitated, her resolve wavering. She wanted to show him the photograph, to tell him about her suspicions, but something held her back. Instead, she turned and headed upstairs, leaving her father standing alone in the living room. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, the photograph playing on a loop in her mind. She decided to sneak into her father's study again, hoping to find more clues. The house was quiet as she tiptoed down the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. The study door was slightly ajar, and she peeked inside. Joseph was slumped over his desk, asleep, with papers scattered around him. She slipped inside, careful not to wake him, and began rifling through the drawers. Most of the papers were boring financial statements and invoices, but one folder caught her eye. It was labeled Insurance, Factory Fire. Inside, she found emails between Joseph and the insurance company, as well as a copy of the policy. Her eyes widened as she read the fine print. Daniel had signed off on a massive increase to the fire insurance just weeks before the blaze. Lily, a groggy voice said behind her. She froze, clutching the folder. Joseph rubbed his eyes, confusion giving way to anger as he realized what she was holding. What are you doing? He demanded, his voice low and sharp. I was just, Lily stammered, her face flushing. You shouldn't be snooping through my things, he snapped, snatching the folder from her hands. But, Dad, why did Uncle Daniel? That's none of your business. Joseph's voice rose, startling her. He immediately regretted his tone, but the damage was done. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she fled the room before he could say another word. In her bedroom, Lily sat on her bed, clutching the photograph. She didn't understand why her father was so angry or why her uncle would increase the insurance. But one thing was clear, there was more to the fire than anyone was letting on. As she stared at the photo, something clicked. She finally remembered where she'd seen that posture before. It was Daniel. The realization hit Lily like a cold gust of wind. She stared at the photograph in her trembling hands, her Uncle Daniel's familiar slouch and stiff posture now unmistakable. Her heart raced as questions flooded her mind. Why would Daniel be at the factory that night? What did he have to gain from the fire? Downstairs, the muffled sound of her parents' argument reached her ears. She crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear their voices. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Emma hissed, her tone low but furious. "Emma, I'm just trying to protect our family," Joseph replied defensively. "By digging into things that don't concern you? You're going to make things worse." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. Her mother's words weren't just dismissive, they were accusatory. Protect them from what? She clutched the photograph tightly and retreated to her room, her mind spinning. The next morning, Lily decided she couldn't keep what she discovered to herself. She had to confront her father, but the prospect of doing so made her stomach churn. He had already been angry with her the previous night. Would he even listen? She found him in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring blankly out the window. The bags under his eyes and the furrow in his brow made him look older than his years. "Dad," she began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph turned, his expression softening when he saw her. "What is it, Lily?" I think I know who was at the factory the night of the fire." She slid the photograph onto the table, her hands trembling. Joseph picked it up, squinting at the grainy image. "Where did you get this?" he asked sharply. "I found it in your study," she admitted, bracing for his anger. "Look closer, Dad. Doesn't that look like Uncle Daniel?" Joseph's breath hitched as he studied the photograph. His hand tightened around the paper, and for a moment, he didn't speak. "Lily, this isn't something you should be worrying about," he said finally, his tone cautious. "But if it was him?" "Lily!" His voice was sharper now, cutting through her words. "Enough. I'll handle it." Tears welled in her eyes. "You keep saying that, but you're not doing anything. Uncle Daniel might have done this, and you're just ignoring it." Joseph stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I said I'll handle it, and that's the end of it," he said firmly before walking out of the kitchen, leaving Lily feeling small and helpless. Later that day, Lily found herself wandering the neighborhood aimlessly, her head filled with unanswered questions. She ended up at the park, where she often went to think. Sitting on a weathered bench, she pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw. The familiar strokes of her pencil against the paper were comforting, even as her thoughts churned. "Nice drawing," a gravelly voice said, startling her. She looked up to see Hank standing a few feet away, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. His face was gaunt, and his eyes darted nervously around the park. "Hank?" Lily said, her voice filled with equal parts surprise and curiosity. She hadn't expected to see him again. He glanced around, as if making sure no one was watching, before sitting on the bench next to her. "I saw you at the factory sometimes," he said. "You're Joseph's kid, right?" Lily nodded, unsure what to say. Hank's presence made her nervous, but there was something desperate in his eyes that kept her from leaving. "I didn't do it," he said abruptly, his voice low but insistent. "I didn't start that fire." "I believe you," Lily said quickly. She hesitated before pulling out the photograph. "Do you know who this is?" Hank studied the image, his brow furrowing. That's him," he said, his voice tinged with recognition. "I saw him that night. He was sneaking around near the back of the factory." "Who?" Lily pressed, her heart pounding. "Your uncle," Hank said flatly. "Daniel." That evening, Lily waited until her parents were distracted before sneaking into her father's study again. She found his phone on the desk and quickly pulled up his call history. Daniel's name appeared frequently, often late at night. She scrolled through the text messages, her heart sinking with every word. One message from Daniel stood out: "Just stick to the plan, Joe. Don't let them dig too deep." Lily's breath hitched. There was a plan? And her father was part of it? She quickly took a photo of the message with her own phone and slipped out of the study, her heart racing. At dinner, the tension was palpable. Joseph seemed distracted, Emma was unusually quiet, and Lily felt as though she might burst from the weight of her secret. "Lily, you've barely touched your food," Emma said, her tone laced with concern. "I'm not hungry," Lily replied, avoiding her mother's gaze. Emma frowned but didn't press further. Joseph, however, finally broke the silence. "Daniel's coming over tomorrow," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. Lily's head snapped up. "Why?" "We need to talk about some things," Joseph said vaguely. "It's nothing for you to worry about." But Lily was worried. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. The next day, Lily stayed in her room, listening intently for Daniel's arrival. When she heard his voice downstairs, her stomach twisted into knots. She crept to the top of the stairs, peeking through the banister as her father and uncle argued in the living room. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" Joseph asked, his tone cold. "You said we needed to talk," Daniel replied, his voice oozing with feigned innocence. "You know what this is about," Joseph snapped, holding up the photograph. "What the hell were you doing at the factory that night?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Careful, Joe. You don't want to start pointing fingers without proof." "I have proof," Joseph retorted. "And if you had anything to do with that fire—" "Watch your mouth," Daniel interrupted, his voice low and menacing. "You're not exactly innocent in all this, are you?" Lily's breath hitched. What did Daniel mean by that? She strained to hear more, but her mother's sudden appearance startled her. "Lily!" Emma hissed. "What are you doing?" Lily turned, her face pale. I heard them yelling." "Go to your room," Emma said sharply, steering her away from the stairs. "Now." Lily obeyed reluctantly, but as she closed the door behind her, one thing was clear: whatever secrets her family was hiding, she was getting closer to the truth. And it terrified her. The tension in the Hartman household reached its breaking point the morning after Daniel's visit. Lily hadn't slept. She lay curled in bed, replaying the muffled argument between her father and uncle over and over. Her mother's insistence on keeping her away from the confrontation only fueled her suspicions. Something was terribly wrong, and she was determined to uncover it. Downstairs, Joseph sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Emma stood by the sink, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You shouldn't have confronted Daniel like that," Emma said, her voice low and tense. "He needed to be confronted," Joseph replied, his tone clipped. "He was at the factory the night of the fire. I saw the photo, I know it was him." "And what are you going to do? Accuse your own brother in public?" Emma shot back. "You don't even have concrete proof." Joseph exhaled sharply, his frustration boiling over. "I can't just sit here and do nothing, Emma. He's hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Lily lingered at the top of the stairs, listening intently. Her father's determination gave her a sliver of hope, but her mother's resistance made her stomach churn. Why was Emma so adamant about protecting Daniel? Later that afternoon, Lily sat in her room with her sketchbook open, but she couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting to the messages she had found on her father's phone and Hank's words in the park. If Daniel was behind the fire, what else was he capable of? She decided to sneak out again, heading toward the train yard where Hank had been found. The sprawling tracks and towering freight cars felt intimidating, but Lily's resolve outweighed her fear. She spotted Hank sitting on an overturned crate, his face weathered and tired. "Hank," she called out, approaching cautiously. He looked up, surprised to see her. "You again? What are you doing here?" "I need your help," Lily said, clutching her backpack tightly. "I think my uncle had something to do with the fire, but no one believes me." Hank studied her for a moment before motioning for her to sit. "What makes you think it was him?" She pulled out the photograph and handed it to him. "You said you saw him that night. This proves it, doesn't it?" Hank examined the photo, nodding slowly. Yeah, that's him. But a photo like this won't be enough to convince anyone. People like your uncle, they don't go down easy. Lily's shoulders slumped. Then what do I do? Hank hesitated, then leaned in closer. There's something you should know. That night, I saw him arguing with someone near the back of the factory. It wasn't your dad, he wasn't even there. It was a woman. A woman? Lily's brow furrowed. Who? I don't know, Hank admitted. But she looked upset. Whatever they were talking about, it wasn't friendly. Lily's mind raced as she walked home. Who could the woman be? And why would she be meeting Daniel at the factory in the middle of the night? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still too many gaps. When she got home, her mother was waiting for her in the living room, her arms crossed. Where have you been? Emma demanded. Out, Lily replied curtly. Emma's eyes narrowed. You've been sneaking around a lot lately. I want to know what's going on. Why? Lily shot back. So you can cover it up like you always do? Emma's face hardened. Watch your tone, young lady. Why are you protecting Uncle Daniel? Lily demanded, her voice rising. I know he was at the factory that night. I have proof. Emma froze, her expression unreadable. You don't know what you're talking about. Yes, I do. Lily yelled. And I'm going to prove it, whether you like it or not. Emma's face darkened with a mix of anger and fear. You're meddling in things you don't understand, Lily. Let it go. But Lily couldn't let it go. Not now. She stormed upstairs, slamming her door behind her. Her mother's reaction only confirmed what she already suspected. There was more to this story than anyone was willing to admit. That night, Lily waited until the house was silent before sneaking downstairs. She needed to see her father's study again, hoping to find something that would connect Daniel to the fire. As she rifled through the desk drawers, she found a key taped to the underside of one of the drawers. It was small and unassuming, but it piqued her curiosity. She searched the room for anything the key might unlock, eventually finding a small locked box in the corner of the room. With shaking hands, she used the key to open it. Inside, she found a collection of papers, photographs, and a USB drive. The papers were insurance documents, but they didn't match the ones she had seen before. These were older, detailing previous claims from years ago. One name stood out, Daniel Hartman. He had filed a claim for a suspicious fire at another property nearly a decade earlier. Lily's blood ran cold. This wasn't the first time Daniel had been involved in a fire. She plugged the USB drive into her father's computer, finding video footage of the factory's security cameras. Most of the clips were unremarkable, showing employees working or deliveries being made. But one clip, dated the night of the fire, showed Daniel entering the factory shortly before midnight. Lily's hands shook as she watched. Daniel wasn't alone. A woman followed him into the building, her face partially obscured by a scarf. They were arguing, gesturing wildly at each other. Daniel pointed toward the far end of the factory, and the woman stormed off-screen. Seconds later, the footage cut out. The next morning, Lily couldn't stay silent any longer. She waited until her father was alone in the kitchen, then placed the USB drive on the table in front of him. "What's this?" Joseph asked, frowning. "Proof," Lily said firmly. Uncle Daniel was at the factory that night. And he wasn't alone. Joseph's expression darkened as he plugged the drive into his laptop. He watched the footage in silence, his face growing grimmer with each passing second. "I knew it," he muttered under his breath. "I knew he was lying." "What are you going to do?" Lily asked, her voice small. Joseph's jaw tightened. "I'm going to confront him. This ends now." But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that confronting Daniel wouldn't be enough. There was still the matter of the mysterious woman. Who was she, and what role had she played in the fire? As her father left to face Daniel, Lily realized the answers she sought might be more dangerous than she ever imagined. The morning was gray and cold, mirroring the storm brewing within the Hartman family. Joseph had barely touched his breakfast, his thoughts consumed by the footage Lily had shown him. Daniel's betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, it was undeniable. But the woman in the footage remained a mystery, an enigma that gnawed at him as much as his brother's treachery. Lily sat across from him, her gaze steady. "You can't let him get away with this, Dad." "I won't," Joseph replied, his voice firm. "But confronting him is going to stir up a lot of trouble. You need to stay out of it." "I want to help," Lily insisted, clutching her locket. "This is my family too." Joseph shook his head. "This isn't a burden you should have to carry, Lily. Let me handle it." Lily's lips tightened into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Deep down, she knew her father was trying to protect her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than even he realized. Joseph arrived at Daniel's house with a mix of anger and apprehension. His brother's sleek suburban home, with its manicured lawn and pristine exterior, felt like a facade, a hollow shell masking the chaos beneath. Daniel answered the door with his usual smirk, but it faltered when he saw the storm in Joseph's eyes. "Joe," Daniel greeted, feigning warmth. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," Joseph said curtly, pushing past him into the living room. Daniel closed the door, his expression hardening. "This doesn't sound like a social visit." Joseph wasted no time. He pulled out his phone and played the footage from the USB drive. The color drained from Daniel's face as he watched himself and the unknown woman enter the factory. "You lied to me," Joseph said, his voice low and steady. "You told me you weren't there that night." Daniel hesitated, his mind racing for an excuse. "I can explain." "Don't!" Joseph snapped. "I don't want your excuses. I want the truth." "Who was the woman?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's none of your business." Joseph stepped closer, his fists clenched. "None of my business?" "You burned down my factory, Daniel. You've destroyed everything I've worked for, and you're telling me it's none of my business?" "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "I just wanted to scare you into selling the land. The woman, she was supposed to make sure it looked like an accident." Joseph's breath caught. "You hired someone to burn down my factory?" "It wasn't supposed to burn down completely," Daniel insisted, his voice desperate now. "Just enough to make you reconsider holding on to it." "I didn't know she'd lose control." Joseph stared at him, disgust and disbelief warring within him. "You're unbelievable. You were willing to risk everything, my business, my reputation, and even Lily's safety, for what? Money?" Daniel's eyes flickered with guilt, but he didn't respond. Meanwhile, at home, Lily was pacing her room, unable to sit still. Her father had been gone for hours, and her nerves were fraying. She decided to take matters into her own hands again, searching online for any information about recent arson cases in the area. It wasn't long before she found a report about a string of suspicious fires tied to a woman matching the description of the figure in the footage. The article included a name, Cassandra Wells, a known arsonist for hire with a history of targeting commercial properties. Lily's stomach churned as she read about the devastation Cassandra had left in her wake. This woman wasn't just reckless, she was dangerous. Lily printed the article and ran downstairs, determined to show it to her father. But when she reached the living room, Emma was waiting for her, a stern expression on her face. "What are you doing now?" Emma demanded. "Research," Lily replied defiantly, holding up the article. "I found out who the woman is. Her name's Cassandra Wells." Emma's face paled, and for a moment, Lily thought she might deny it. But instead, her mother sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "Mom?" Lily asked cautiously. "Do you know her?" Emma nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's an old acquaintance." Lily's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Emma looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "Before your father started the distillery, we were struggling. Cassandra offered to help us, financially. But her help came with strings. When we couldn't pay her back, she started threatening us. And now she's back? Lily asked, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell Dad? I thought I could handle it, Emma admitted. I didn't want to drag him into it again. But then Daniel got involved, and everything spiraled out of control. At Daniel's house, Joseph was about to leave when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Emma. We need to talk. It's about Cassandra. Joseph's stomach sank. He looked at Daniel one last time, his expression cold. You're going to pay for what you've done. I'll make sure of it. As he left, Daniel called after him, his voice filled with panic. Joe, wait! You don't understand, she's not finished. Cassandra, she's dangerous. Joseph didn't respond. He climbed into his car, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they'd formed was more terrifying than he'd imagined. When Joseph returned home, Emma and Lily were waiting for him in the living room. Lily handed him the article about Cassandra, and Emma reluctantly recounted her history with the woman. Joseph listened in stunned silence, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Why didn't you tell me? He asked Emma, his voice strained. I was trying to protect you, Emma said, tears streaming down her face. I thought if I kept her away, we could move on. But then Daniel brought her back into our lives. Joseph pinched the bridge of his nose, struggling to contain his frustration. This changes everything. If Cassandra is involved, this isn't just about the fire anymore. It's about our safety. Lily stepped forward, her voice firm despite her fear. Dad, we have to stop her. Joseph nodded, his resolve hardening. We will. But we have to be smart about this. Cassandra isn't just going to walk away. We need proof, something that ties her to the fire and Daniel. That night, the Hartman family huddled together, formulating a plan. For the first time in weeks, they felt like a united front. But as they prepared to confront Cassandra and expose the truth, a shadowy figure watched their home from the street. Cassandra Wells wasn't finished with the Hartmans yet. The following day dawned ominously, with heavy clouds darkening the sky. The Hartman household was quiet but tense, every family member lost in their own thoughts. Joseph sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the documents Lily had uncovered about Cassandra Wells. Each detail painted a chilling picture of a woman who thrived on destruction and chaos. Lily, meanwhile, sketched nervously in her room, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Cassandra Wells wasn't just a random accomplice, she was a deliberate choice by Daniel, a weapon aimed at their family. But why had her uncle gone to such lengths? Was it simply about money, or was there something deeper driving his actions? Emma busied herself in the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She had tried calling Cassandra the night before, but there was no response. Now, her worry had morphed into dread. If Cassandra was back, she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. That afternoon, Joseph decided to take action. Armed with the USB drive and the article Lily had found, he drove to the police station. The officer who had been investigating the fire, Detective Grant, greeted him with a firm handshake. Mr. Hartman, Grant began, what brings you here? I have evidence, Joseph said, handing over the USB drive. My brother was at the factory the night of the fire, and he wasn't alone. The woman with him, Cassandra Wells, has a history of arson. Grant's brow furrowed as he plugged the drive into his computer. He watched the footage, his expression growing darker with each passing second. This is significant, he said finally. But we'll need more than just footage to bring charges against Cassandra or your brother. Do you have anything else tying them to the fire? Joseph hesitated. Not yet. But my wife, she knows Cassandra. There's a history there. Grant nodded. That could be useful. But be careful, Mr. Hartman. If Cassandra Wells is involved, you're dealing with someone who doesn't play by the rules. Back at home, Lily was growing restless. Her father had been gone for hours, and the tension in the house was unbearable. She decided to take a walk to clear her head. As she strolled through the neighborhood, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Turning a corner, she caught a glimpse of a woman in a dark coat standing by a parked car. The woman's face was obscured by sunglasses and a scarf, but Lily's heart skipped a beat. It was her, the woman from the footage. Lily ducked behind a tree, her breathing shallow. She watched as the woman lit a cigarette, her movements deliberate and unhurried. After a few minutes, the woman got into the car and drove away. Lily sprinted home, her mind racing. Cassandra Wells wasn't just a name in an article anymore, she was real, and she was here. Joseph returned home just as Lily burst through the front door. Her face was pale, and she was visibly shaking. "Dad," she exclaimed. "I saw her. Cassandra. She was right around the corner." Joseph's heart sank. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Lily insisted. "It was her. I'm sure of it." Emma, who had been eavesdropping from the kitchen, stepped into the room. Her face was tight with worry. "If she's watching us, it means she's planning something," Emma said. "We need to be careful." Joseph nodded, his jaw set. "We need to stay one step ahead of her." "Emma, do you still have any way to contact her?" Emma hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "I tried calling her yesterday, but she didn't answer." "I can try again." Joseph placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do it. Tell her we need to talk. If she thinks we're willing to negotiate, it might buy us some time." That evening, Emma finally received a call back. Cassandra's voice was as smooth and cold as ice. "Emma," Cassandra drawled. "It's been a long time." "We need to talk," Emma said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Oh? About what?" "You know what," Emma replied. "The factory. Daniel. All of it." Cassandra laughed, a low, chilling sound. "You've always been so dramatic." "Fine. Let's talk. But on my terms." "Where?" Emma asked. "I'll text you," Cassandra said before hanging up. Emma turned to Joseph and Lily, her hands trembling. "She wants to meet. But I don't trust her." "You're not going alone," Joseph said firmly. Lily's eyes widened. "You're going to meet her?" "We have to," Joseph said. "If we don't, she'll keep coming after us." The text arrived an hour later, directing them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Joseph and Emma decided to go together, leaving Lily at home under strict instructions to lock all the doors and call the police if anything happened. As they approached the warehouse, the eerie silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the gravel. The door creaked open, revealing Cassandra waiting inside. She leaned against a rusted beam, her cigarette glowing faintly in the dim light. "Joseph." "Emma," Cassandra greeted, her tone mockingly pleasant. "How nice of you to join me." "Cut the games," Joseph said. "We know what you and Daniel did." Cassandra smirked. "Do you, now?" "We have footage of you at the factory," Joseph continued. "The police are already involved." "It's over." Cassandra's expression darkened, and she took a step closer. "You think you can scare me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Why, Cassandra? Why are you doing this? Why?" Cassandra echoed, her voice dripping with venom. "Because your family owes me. You think you can just walk away from your debts? From me? I don't think so." Joseph clenched his fists. "This ends now. If you walk away, we won't press charges. But if you keep coming after us, I'll make sure you go down for this." Cassandra's laugh echoed through the warehouse. "You're in no position to make demands, Joseph. But I'll tell you what, I'll think about it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Joseph and Emma standing in the dimly lit space, their nerves frayed and their future uncertain. When they returned home, they found Lily waiting anxiously. "What happened?" she asked. Joseph sighed. "It's not over. Not yet." Lily looked at her father, her fear giving way to determination. "Then we'll stop her. Together." Joseph nodded, pulling his daughter into a tight hug. As much as he wanted to shield her from the darkness that had engulfed their family, he knew they would need her strength to see this through. But as the Hartmans prepared for the battle ahead, Cassandra's parting words lingered ominously in their minds. What would she do next? The Hartman house felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corners, seemed ominous. Joseph paced the living room, his thoughts consumed by Cassandra's veiled threats. Emma sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she held a mug of tea, while Lily perched on the armrest, her sketchbook abandoned on the coffee table. "We can't wait for her to make the next move," Joseph said, breaking the heavy silence. "We need to get ahead of her." "And how do you propose we do that?" Emma asked, her voice brittle. "She's dangerous, Joseph. You saw her tonight. She doesn't scare easily." "Maybe not, but she makes mistakes," Joseph replied. "She left a trail before, fires, evidence. There's got to be something we can use to take her down." "Do you think the police will be able to protect us?" Lily asked, her voice small but steady. Joseph hesitated. "Detective Grant is working on it, but he doesn't have enough yet. If we're going to stop Cassandra, we'll need more than just speculation." Lily thought about the footage of Cassandra and Daniel arguing in the factory. What about Uncle Daniel? He knows more than he's saying. If we can get him to tell the truth, maybe the police can finally act. Joseph nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. It's time Daniel faces the consequences of what he's done." The next morning, Joseph drove to Daniel's house, his resolve hardening with each mile. When he arrived, Daniel opened the door, his face pale and drawn. "Joe," Daniel began, his voice shaky. "Listen, I—" "Save it," Joseph interrupted, stepping inside uninvited. "We need to talk. Now." Daniel shut the door, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He led Joseph into the living room, where the faint smell of alcohol lingered in the air. "What do you want me to say?" Daniel asked, sinking into an armchair. "I've already told you everything." "No, you haven't," Joseph said, his voice cold. "I know about Cassandra. I know you hired her to start the fire. But what I don't know is why. Why go to these lengths, Daniel? What are you hiding?" Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, his guilt written across his features. "I didn't have a choice," he said finally. She threatened me. She said if I didn't cooperate, she'd come after me and my family." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "So instead, you let her come after mine? You let her destroy my factory, put my daughter's life at risk, just to save your own skin?" "I thought I could control her," Daniel said weakly. "I thought if I played along, she'd leave us all alone." Joseph leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "You're going to the police, Daniel. You're going to tell them everything." Daniel looked at him, panic flashing in his eyes. "If I do that, she'll kill me." "If you don't, I will," Joseph replied, his tone icy. "And that's a promise." Meanwhile, back at home, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. She sat in her room, flipping through her sketchbook in search of comfort, but her usual escape wasn't working. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Cassandra's menacing presence and the way her mother had seemed so afraid of her. Lily decided to search the internet again for more information about Cassandra. She found articles detailing previous fires linked to the woman, each one meticulously planned, each victim left in financial ruin. But one article stood out, a news report from years ago mentioning a business partner who had allegedly hired Cassandra for a similar scheme. The article didn't name the partner, but Lily had a sinking feeling it was someone close to her family. She printed the article and ran downstairs to show her mother. Emma took one look at it and turned pale. "Mom," Lily pressed, "what's going on?" Do you know who this is about? Emma hesitated, then nodded slowly. It's about your father. What? Lily's voice was a mix of shock and disbelief. Dad was involved with Cassandra? Not directly, Emma explained, her voice shaking. Before he started the distillery, he was desperate to save our finances. He took advice from someone who recommended Cassandra. But when he found out what she really did, he backed out. Why didn't you tell me this before? Lily demanded. Because I thought it was over, Emma said, tears welling in her eyes. I thought we were safe. Lily's mind raced. Cassandra's vendetta wasn't just about Daniel or the factory, it was personal. And now, the whole family was in her crosshairs. That evening, Joseph returned home, his face grim. He told Emma and Lily about his confrontation with Daniel and the promise he had forced from his brother. Daniel's going to the police tomorrow, Joseph said. With his testimony and the footage, we should have enough to bring Cassandra down. But what if she finds out? Lily asked. She's already watching us. What if she tries to stop him? Joseph placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll make sure she doesn't. I'll call Detective Grant and let him know what's happening. The police will keep an eye on Daniel. The night passed fitfully for the Hartmans. Lily slept with her locket clutched tightly in her hand, while Joseph and Emma lay awake, their thoughts consumed by the looming confrontation. In the early hours of the morning, a sharp knock at the door jolted them from their restless sleep. Joseph grabbed a baseball bat from the closet before cautiously opening the door. Standing on the porch was Detective Grant, his expression grim. Mr. Hartman, Grant began, I'm afraid there's been an incident. What kind of incident? Joseph asked, his voice tightening. It's your brother, Grant said. We found him in his car, unconscious. It looks like he was attacked. Joseph's heart sank. Is he? He's alive, Grant assured him. But he's in the hospital, and he hasn't regained consciousness yet. Whatever he knew about Cassandra, someone didn't want him to talk. Lily, who had crept to the top of the stairs, overheard every word. Her blood ran cold as she realized the lengths Cassandra would go to silence her enemies. As the detective left, Joseph turned to Emma and Lily, his expression one of grim determination. She won't stop, Joseph said. Not until we stop her first. Lily nodded, her fear giving way to a steely resolve. Then we fight back. The family knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but they were no longer willing to sit idly by. It was time to take the fight to Cassandra Wills. The sun rose hesitantly, casting pale light over a city that felt colder and more hostile than ever. Inside the Hartman home, the air was thick with unspoken fears and simmering determination. Joseph had spent the night making calls, arranging for additional police surveillance and trying to piece together the next steps. Emma sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee untouched before her, while Lily paced back and forth, clutching her sketchbook tightly. Dad, Lily said finally, her voice trembling but firm, we can't wait any longer. We have to stop her before someone else gets hurt. Joseph nodded, though his exhaustion was evident. I know. Detective Grant said he'll meet us at the hospital later. If Daniel wakes up, he might be able to tell us something that'll give us the upper hand. Do you think she'll try to come after us next? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She's watching, Joseph replied grimly. But she won't make a move until she's sure she can silence us. Lily sat down across from her parents, her face pale but resolute. Then we make the first move. At the hospital, Daniel lay unconscious in a stark, sterile room. Bandages wrapped around his head and arms bore testament to the viciousness of the attack. Joseph stood by his brother's bed, a mixture of anger and guilt roiling in his chest. This is what she does, Joseph muttered. She destroys people. And now she's doing it to us. Detective Grant joined them, his expression grave. We found some evidence at the scene, traces of an accelerant in Daniel's car. It looks like Cassandra tried to make it look like he was involved in another arson. She's trying to frame him, Joseph said bitterly. Or send a message. She's sending more than a message, Grant replied. She's escalating. If we don't stop her soon, this could end in tragedy. Lily stood by the door, her fists clenched. She felt powerless watching the adults talk in circles. Her uncle lay broken in the bed, her family was falling apart, and the woman responsible was out there, untouchable. As they left the hospital, Joseph's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the old distillery. Come alone, or your family pays the price. Joseph's heart pounded. He showed the text to Emma and Grant, his hands shaking. It's Cassandra, he said. She wants to meet. She's trying to bait you, Grant warned. If you go alone, you're playing right into her hands. What choice do I have? Joseph shot back. She's already heard Daniel. If I don't go, who knows what she'll do next? I'm coming with you, Grant said firmly. We'll set up a team nearby. If anything happens, we'll move in. That night, Joseph drove to the ruins of the distillery. The air was cold and heavy, and the skeletal remains of the factory loomed like a ghost from another life. He parked his car and stepped out, his hands trembling as he scanned the shadows for any sign of Cassandra. Joseph, a voice called from the darkness. Cassandra emerged from the shadows, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. She looked calm, almost amused, as she approached him. You came, she said with a smirk. I wasn't sure you would. I'm here, Joseph said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. What do you want? What I've always wanted, Cassandra replied. What you and your family owe me. We don't owe you anything, Joseph said through gritted teeth. You got what you deserved years ago. Leave us alone. Cassandra laughed, a cold, cruel sound. You think this is about money? It's about power, Joseph. Control. And right now, I'm the one in control. She stepped closer, her eyes glinting with malice. Your brother learned that the hard way. Do you want to see what happens when you defy me? Hidden nearby, Detective Grant and his team watched the scene unfold. Grant's radio crackled as one of his officers reported movement in the area. Keep your positions, Grant ordered. We move on my signal. Back at the Hartman house, Lily sat by the window, staring out into the night. She couldn't stand the waiting, the helplessness. Her sketchbook lay forgotten on her lap, her pencil idle. She turned to Emma, who sat silently across the room. Why didn't you tell me about Cassandra sooner? Lily asked, her voice soft but tinged with hurt. Emma sighed, her shoulders slumping. I was trying to protect you. I thought if we didn't talk about her, she'd stay in the past. But she didn't, Lily said. And now she's ruining everything. I know, Emma said, tears brimming in her eyes. And I'll never forgive myself for letting her get this far. Lily moved to sit beside her mother, taking her hand. We'll get through this, Mom. But we have to face it together. At the distillery, Cassandra circled Joseph like a predator stalking its prey. Do you know what I love most about fire? She mused. It doesn't just destroy, it cleanses. It wipes the slate clean. You're insane, Joseph spat. You won't get away with this. Oh, but I already have, Cassandra said, her smile widening. Your brother tried to betray me, and look where it got him. Do you really think you'll fare any better? Joseph stood his ground, his fists clenched. You've already lost, Cassandra. The police know about you. They're watching right now. For the first time, Cassandra's composure faltered. She glanced around, her expression darkening. You're bluffing. Joseph smirked. Am I? Before Cassandra could respond, Detective Grant's voice rang out. Cassandra Wells, you're under arrest. Put your hands in the air. Cassandra's eyes flashed with fury as officers swarmed the area. She reached into her coat, but before she could act, Grant tackled her to the ground, wresting a small lighter from her grasp. It's over, Grant said, cuffing her hands behind her back. "You're done." Cassandra glared at Joseph as the officers led her away. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll regret this, Joseph Hartman. Mark my words." Joseph watched as she was taken into custody, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. For the first time in weeks, the nightmare seemed to be ending. Back at home, Lily and Emma hugged Joseph tightly as he walked through the door. "Is it over?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "It's over," Joseph said, holding his daughter close. "She's gone." But as they stood together, the weight of the past weeks still hung heavy. They had won, but the scars of what they had endured would remain. And as Lily glanced at her sketchbook, she realized their story was far from finished. It was time to rebuild, not just their lives, but the trust and love that had been tested so deeply. The weeks following Cassandra Wells' arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media frenzy, and emotional recovery. Joseph, Emma, and Lily found themselves navigating the wreckage of their lives, trying to piece together what had been broken. The distillery was gone, Daniel remained in the hospital recovering, and the scars left by Cassandra's reign of terror still lingered. But there was hope. It flickered like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. One afternoon, Joseph sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread before him. Insurance forms, legal documents, and plans for the future. He had spent years building Hartman Craft Distillery from the ground up, and though the physical building was gone, the spirit of his work wasn't. Lily walked in, clutching her sketchbook. She sat across from her father, her face serious. "Are you rebuilding the distillery?" Joseph hesitated, then nodded. "That's the plan. It won't be easy, but I can't let Cassandra take everything from us." Lily opened her sketchbook and slid it toward him. Inside was a detailed drawing of a new distillery, complete with modern equipment and a sleek, welcoming facade. "Maybe you could use this," she said shyly. Joseph stared at the sketch, his throat tightening. "This is incredible, Lily. You've got a real talent." Lily smiled faintly. "I just want to help. The distillery was always a part of you, Dad. I want it to be part of us, too." Joseph reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It already is. And it always will be." Meanwhile, Emma paid a visit to Daniel at the hospital. He was awake but looked worn, his face pale and his eyes haunted. She sat beside him, unsure of where to begin. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Daniel said before she could speak. "I don't even forgive myself." Emma sighed. "You made terrible choices, Daniel. You put us all in danger. But you're still my brother-in-law, and you're still family. We'll help you through this, but you have to want to change." Daniel nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. "I do. I want to make things right." The legal battle against Cassandra was grueling, but Detective Grant's team had built a solid case. Between Daniel's testimony, the security footage, and the evidence found at her hideout, Cassandra was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned to Joseph one last time. "You think this is over?" she sneered. "People like me don't just disappear." Joseph met her gaze, unflinching. "No, but people like us don't stop fighting." Cassandra was taken away, her threats echoing like a distant storm. But this time, Joseph felt no fear. The Hartmans had faced their darkest days and survived. Months later, the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Hartman Craft Distillery brought a rare moment of celebration. Friends, family, and employees gathered to support the Hartmans as they embarked on a new chapter. Lily stood by her father's side, holding the ceremonial shovel. "Do you want to do the honors?" Joseph asked, handing her the shovel. Lily grinned. "Only if you help." Together, they turned the first mound of soil, symbolizing not just the rebuilding of the distillery, but the rebuilding of their family. The crowd cheered, and for the first time in a long while, Joseph felt a sense of peace. Later that evening, the family gathered around the fireplace. Emma poured hot cocoa, Lily sketched in her book, and Joseph flipped through old family photos. They laughed, reminisced, and for the first time in weeks, the weight of the past seemed to lift. "You know," Joseph said, looking at a photo of the original distillery, "I thought losing this place would break us. But it didn't." Emma nodded, her eyes soft. "Because we didn't let it." Lily looked up from her sketchbook. "And because we're stronger together." Joseph smiled, pulling his daughter into a hug. "That we are, sweetheart. That we are." As the night wore on, Lily found herself staring out the window, the stars twinkling brightly against the inky sky. She clutched her locket, thinking about everything they had been through. The fire, the betrayal, the fear, it had all tested her in ways she never imagined. But it had also taught her the value of resilience, the power of family, and the importance of standing up to the darkness. Turning back to her sketchbook, she began a new drawing. This one wasn't of the distillery or the chaos they had endured. It was of her family, standing together, stronger than ever. And in the quiet of the Hartman home, the promise of a brighter future took root.